All right, thank you all very much for coming. So to give some background for what I'm doing here, in an ideal marketplace, resources or assets will be allocated to the best users of those assets. However, if those users are financially constrained, or in other words, if they're unable to raise enough money in order to invest in those assets, then those assets may be held by less productive users. Now, in other words, this misallocation of resources can have wide-ranging implications and can even explain differences in factor productivity between countries and also things such as GDP. Now, to take a step forward from a theoretical perspective, if we alleviate the financial constraints of these users, in other words, enable them to raise financing in order to make these investments, then this can help to reduce this asset misallocation. In other words, it can create a reallocation of assets towards more productive users, thereby improving a number of real outcomes. And a number of papers in the literature have suggested that this can even help to explain economic growth. So it's very important in general to understand this sort of channel. Now, despite the importance, though, of this channel, cleanly testing this effect is difficult. And it's difficult for a few different reasons. The first is that one needs to measure asset reallocation, which is often difficult due to data set limitations. The second is that shocks to financial constraints are often also related to future investment opportunities or productivity of firms themselves. So in order to cleanly test this sort of channel, one needs an exogenous shock to financial constraints that's unrelated to the fundamental cash flows of the asset itself. So what I try and do in my paper is to overcome these difficulties and examine a setting where, when the financial constraints of firms are relaxed due to an exogenous liquidity shock, how does that affect the reallocation of assets and, in turn, real outcomes such as productivity, output, and asset values. Now, in order to test this, I examine a unique setting, which is the agricultural sector in Oklahoma. Now, why Oklahoma and why farming? Well, I believe this is the ideal setting because of the data set availability it affords me, the institutional setting, and the strategy I'm able to pursue. So first of all, this is appealing because most farms are small businesses that invest in a specialized asset, specifically farmland, and who also have expert users. Second of all, farmers in the US tend to be financially constrained, and there's a large agricultural economics literature that has suggested this. And finally, farmers in Oklahoma experience exogenous cash inflows which were caused by an expansion of hydraulic fracturing or fracking oil drilling leases, which in turn relaxed their financial constraints. Now, to give you a little bit of background here, hydraulic fracturing, or as it's often called fracking, is the process of extracting oil from deep underground shale rock formations. Now, in Oklahoma and other states, fracking flooded the marketplace starting in about 2005, and you can see this graph across Oklahoma of new fracking wells, where the number was flat until the mid-2000s and then increased exponentially. And this picture kind of puts it in perspective. So the left graph is across the state of Oklahoma, the number of active wells prior to 2005, and then this is the number right now. So you can see it's just an explosion across the entirety of the state. Now, in terms of my purposes, and importantly, fracking and farming can and do occur at the same time for a few different reasons. The first is that the average size of a drilling pad is about 3.7 acres, and the average farm size in Oklahoma is about 450 acres. So in general, it takes up less than 1% of the average farm, as you can see by this graph here, and then you can see a picture of a farmer continuing his operations with the drill in the background. So for that reason, fracking does not significantly affect the cash flows from farming itself. Now, the second reason for that is because there's a unique institutional detail in the state of Oklahoma. There's what's called a split estate ownership system for any given parcel of land. So in other words, any given piece of land has a split between surface rights and mineral rights underneath the ground. And the two are completely separately traded assets. So an oil company that wants to do fracking must enter into a lease with the owners of the mineral rights underneath the ground. Now, farmers who own mineral rights and enter into these leases will receive large cash payments, whereas other farmers will not. And the magnitude is very large. So to give you a sense, it's very typical to see a lease of about $10,000 per acre. So very typically, this will represent a payment of hundreds of thousands of dollars to a typical farmer. And moreover, this pattern of ownership was established decades ago, and there's very sparse trading of these mineral rights. So this can be taken as exogenous to an individual farmer. So for this reason also, fracking does not directly affect the cash flows of the farmland, or in other words, the value of the surface rights, because of this split between the surface and the mineral rights. Now, my empirical strategy, very briefly, is going to be to examine the entry of fracking into an area and compare how many farmers actually experience these liquidity shocks based on how many own mineral rights. So I'll do a differences in differences framework, where I look after the arrival of fracking and compare counties where many farmers own mineral rights, and therefore many farmers will receive these cash payments, compared to counties where few farmers own mineral rights. Now, in terms of my results, I first examine land purchases by farmers. And I show that in the counties where many farmers own mineral rights and receive these cash payments, farmers increase their number of land purchases by about 18% relative to the treatment group or the control group, and they increase their purchases of acres by about 47%. Now, I then delve into the specific reallocation effects that are underlying these results. And I first examine a reallocation between farms, and more specifically that high productivity farmers are purchasing from low productivity farmers. So in order to do this, I examine purchases in low yield counties, which are the low productivity counties, where yield is the standard measure of agricultural productivity. And I examine whether farmers that reside in high productivity counties are purchasing in those low productivity areas. And I do so in a triple differences specification, where the dependent variable is the number of purchases in low productivity areas. And the interpretation here is that after the arrival of fracking, in the areas where many farmers own mineral rights, whether the high productivity farmers purchase in the low productivity areas. And that's what I find here. So this is evidence that high productivity farmers are purchasing from low productivity farmers, which is consistent with an efficient reallocation effect. Now, the second reallocation channel I look at is purchases from non-farmers by farmers. So I look at the total acreage of vacant land that is purchased by farmers, and I show that farmers increase their purchases of vacant land from non-farm users by about 50% in these areas where they receive large cash inflows. So this, again, is consistent with a reallocation in that farmers, who could be considered the expert users of land, are purchasing from outside users who are not putting the land to any productive use. Now, I then explore real outcomes following this reallocation effect. And consistent with a reallocation towards more productive users, I find that wheat production increases in these areas where many farmers own mineral rights. The number of wheat acres cultivated goes up by about 8%. Wheat yield, which is the measure of productivity, increases by about 12%. And then profits also increase on the order of magnitude of about 15% in these areas. So this in total is again consistent with an efficiency enhancing reallocation effect following this cash inflow. Now, the next thing I look at is the effect on farmland prices. And I show that in these areas where many farmers receive these cash inflows, the price of farmland increases by about 20 to 40% in these areas compared to the control group. And what's worth noting here is that this is just the price of the surface rights. And so it doesn't incorporate the cash flows from the oil, which shows an asset pricing effect. So in other words, it's consistent with the farmland being in the hands of more efficient users who are able to extract higher cash flows from the land. And then finally, I examine what the farmers do with the rest of their money. And one thing I look at is debt. And I show that one use of the land is that farmers seem to pay down the amount that they're borrowing compared with the control group. So to conclude, I examine in this paper how the relaxation of financial constraints through a shock that has no effect on the firm's fundamentals has important real effects through a reallocation of assets. And my key results are that in the areas where many farmers experience these liquidity shocks, farmers increase their purchases of land. There's evidence of a reallocation of land both between farmers and from non-farm users towards farmers. There are increases in average output, productivity, and profits. There's also an increase in asset prices, and farmers also reduce their borrowing. And the main takeaway here is that the relaxation of financial constraints can induce a value-enhancing reallocation of assets. Thank you very much.